Hello, welcome everybody. This is Stephen Doig, the Director of Research at the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society. Thank you all for joining us again, or many of you again. It's my pleasure today to introduce the speaker, Kaitlyn Bunker, who's going to talk about her work in the Caribbean island nations of the Eastern Caribbean. I had the fortunate benefits of working with Kaitlyn for a number of years when I was at Rocky Mountain Institute, and it's really a pleasure to have her speak with all of you and take questions. So let me just give you a quick thumbnail sketch of her background, and then Kaitlyn's going to take it away. She's a lead of the Islands Energy Program at the Rocky Mountain Institute and does both the technical analysis but also the economic analysis that goes along with it. I think her real hallmark in that work has been to develop a very far-reaching and thoughtful program that begins by engaging communities, understanding different stakeholder groups and understanding what their goals are, and rather than lofting in energy solutions from the outside, actually co-creating those solutions and meeting community and stakeholder needs over time in a way that's both technically feasible, resilient, and economically viable. Before coming to RMI, Kaitlyn pursued an education which gave her both her bachelor's, her master's, and her PhD in electrical engineering at Michigan Technology University in Houghton, Michigan. I've actually been to that place, even though it's in the UP and it's pretty far from everywhere else, but it's a super great school. And it's very rare these days, actually, to be honest, that you find power engineers like Kaitlyn, and even rarer when they're women. So it's actually a special treat to have her here with us, I think, demonstrating the kinds of capabilities and career paths that people can take like her. So without further ado, Kaitlyn, I'd like to hand over the reins to you and take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Stephen, for the introduction and just the invitation to be here today and share some thoughts with everybody. I'm really excited to talk a bit about my experience and our team's experience working in the Caribbean region, as Stephen mentioned, on clean energy transition, and really what we've learned from partnering with different islands to look at their opportunities for energy transition, what are optimal pathways, and how to get there faster. So when I mention the Caribbean and working in islands, you might picture something like this, which is true. This is in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You know, many of the islands that we get to work in are beautiful places, and we're lucky to be able to visit them. But to give you a picture of what our work actually looks like, it's more like this. We're often in a conference room, maybe with no windows, gathering together with stakeholders. So, you know, we get to visit these beautiful places, but we often have to remind our own colleagues as well that we're there to work, and we, you know, are doing more something like this than sitting out on the beach all of the time. Today, what I'd love to talk a bit about with all of you and share with you is a bit about why Rocky Mountain Institute, as a global, you know, nonprofit organization focused on clean energy, why are we working with small islands? I'd like to describe our approach, our integrated approach to working with islands and accelerating their clean energy transitions, and you know, talk about why that's important, why working in small islands is important, through providing practical examples of island experiences in what's really become their role as energy transition leaders. So that's what I hope to share with all of you today, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussion as well. So first, just some context about islands in the Caribbean in general and their electricity systems. You may be familiar that islands are quite vulnerable to the wide-ranging effects of climate change, and they're starting to see impacts today. So they're some of the first to see direct impacts such as sea level rise, more frequent and sustained hurricane systems. Here's Hurricane Dorian just last year over the Bahamas. So they're starting to see these impacts already. Meanwhile, the electricity systems that they have aren't helping the situation and the vulnerability. So just like we see often in the US and other large countries, there's a bias towards electricity systems that are centralized, meaning there's, in some cases in islands, just one generation plant where the electricity is generated. And that plant is typically powered by fossil fuel. And then that electricity is shared throughout the island through a transmission and distribution system. So that very centralized and fossil fueled energy system puts strain on island nations in the face of the vulnerability that they're facing for a couple of reasons. With those fossil fuels that are used, those typically have to be imported to islands. They don't have those resources locally. So they're importing typically diesel fuel that can be quite expensive and makes the cost of the overall electricity system very expensive, despite the fact that they have local renewable resources that are almost always a cheaper option. And we can talk more about costs today as well. And then the electricity infrastructure itself. So having that one centralized plant and then transmission lines that go out across the island doesn't lend itself to a very resilient system, especially to extreme shocks like hurricanes. And so islands are facing these challenges when big events like hurricanes happen that make it difficult for them to be able to withstand in the first place, but then bounce back quickly and come back from an event like that because their electricity system doesn't support that happening. The other thing I'll mention here is, islands are some of the first to see the impacts of climate change. At the same time, their direct contribution to emissions is quite small. You can imagine, even though they're burning diesel fuel for electricity, there's just the scale of the islands that we're talking about compared to larger countries is quite minimal. And so it's an interesting balance there of the impacts that they're seeing versus the impacts that they are contributing to climate change. So Rocky Mountain Institute in our Islands Energy Program has really put our focus on resilient distributed energy resources. That's what I put as DERs here, to really drive clean energy transitions and enhance resilience for islands. And we do that with sort of two main outcomes in mind. First is the direct impact. So for the people that are living on islands, finding benefits for them in terms of lowering energy costs, increasing the resilience of their electricity systems, which underpin the rest of their societies often. So we really see that as important as having this direct impact for people that live on islands. We also see another key outcome, which is broader and focused more on global proof points. So as island systems are going through this clean energy transition, incorporating resilience and energy together in their planning and their implementation, identifying ways that the things that are relevant that can accelerate the adoption of similar approaches and transitions in larger economies, in other geographies. Certainly there's unique aspects of islands, but there's also commonalities across electricity systems themselves, across communities around the world. And so that's sort of the second driver of our work is identifying the global proof points, the things that can inspire on the one hand, but also just more practically help accelerate clean energy transition around the world. So that's sort of why we do the work we do. I mentioned electricity costs in the Caribbean. And so here's a bit more context on that. On average, what people are paying for electricity is about 3 times in the Caribbean compared to what we pay in the US. And again, this is largely due to the use of imported fossil fuels. Expensive to do that, especially at the scale of island electricity systems, quite small. The other aspect here that's not captured in these sort of averages is the volatility. So as the world oil market fluctuates, that increase or decrease in cost of that imported fuel gets passed through to consumers as well. So from month to month, there's a portion of the electricity bill that's based on what the actual fuel cost was the month before. If oil prices are down, you see that reduction as a resident or a business owner. If oil prices are back up, you see that increase as well. And so not only are they high to begin with, but they can be a bit unpredictable. And as you're trying to plan, whether that's for your family or your business, that volatility on top of an already high price, isn't something that's helpful for folks. So clearly an opportunity here, a clear business case to pursue alternatives that result in lower electricity costs. At the same time, it's important to consider other priorities. Most of the islands that we work with absolutely want to lower their electricity costs. They also may have other priorities. And so we can often find solutions that have multiple benefits that do things like lower costs while increasing resilience. So to give you some examples of that, here's some overviews from a couple of islands where we've done really deep energy planning work. We often bring together a key set of stakeholders that include the government, if there's a Ministry of Energy or an energy unit, whomever within the government is focused on energy, and then the utility company that provides electricity on the island. If there's regulation of the electricity system, they're involved as well. We bring all these parties together, and what we typically find is that they're actually more on the same page than they might have thought, but they haven't necessarily come together and said, actually, we have similar goals. Let's figure out how to work towards those. And so we as a neutral third party can often help that come together. And so we often start these types of energy planning processes with much more of a high level discussion and question and asking, what are your top priorities? What do you want to see your electricity system in your country look like in the near term and the long term? And what we found is that there's a fairly common set of top priorities, but when we really push and say, okay, what's the number one thing that can't be compromised at all, then we start to see differences among islands. And so some of that is shown here where, maybe resilience is top of the list in one place. Low cost is top of the list in another place. When we talk about reliability here, we're talking about more the day-to-day operation of the system, the normal operations. Does everybody have power all the time when they need it through a consistent system, not a lot of outages, separate from resilience being more in the case of something like a hurricane? How could the system ride through that, and how quickly could service be restored? And so you'll see that sometimes those are called out very clearly as separate priorities. Economic development has come up as key priorities and sometimes is at the very top of the list. Like we saw in Belize, job and industry creation is how it was framed in the British Virgin Islands. Still a key priority, made it in the top list, but ranked below some of the others, as you can see here. So that certainly for me has been a key takeaway of whenever we start working in a new place or new to us, coming in with some sense of what we've learned, what we've seen in other places, and bringing that expertise and offering that to support, balanced with coming with a very open mind and saying, we're here to learn about this country, this island, what's important to you, and what you want to focus on, and being in this more listening mode to build this understanding of what's important. And then we can go into the work to say, okay, what are the options that can best support across the board here and advance towards all of these priorities and try to find those interconnections. So I'll share a bit about specifically what RMI does to support islands in doing that once we've sort of laid out, okay, this is what's most important here. And there's three main ways that we work. One, and the one that I've been most deeply involved in, is thinking about a really inclusive energy planning process to explore and then identify what's the optimal energy solution, again, against those priorities that that country has set. And so one way to sum this up, and a handy way to remember it, is to think about the 3 A's. So there really is a lot of focus on aligning stakeholders in our planning processes. So again, bringing together whomever are the right stakeholders in that island, but typically the government and the utility, to not necessarily get them aligned, because often they are, as I mentioned, but make them aware that they are aligned, and there's ways that they can work together to really move forward. Then in the center, you see the second A, analysis. So this is where we dig really deeply into options for the future. And as Stephen mentioned at the beginning, there's various aspects to this. So there's the technical side. How will the system actually operate? How will the demand for electricity actually be met, you know, today and projected into the future in every hour? How will electricity needs be met? But then there's the economic side to that as well. What will it actually cost to implement and then operate new resources, integrate them into the system, perhaps retire some resources? How does that come together in a total system cost, and what does that mean for residents who are using electricity? So we dig into a lot of that analysis, and then specifically how do different scenarios perform against the priorities. And so we'll look at certain metrics that we can use to try to measure resilience, for example, and say, be able to compare the scenarios against each other to say which one does the best for resilience. Now, what do costs look like? And basically, where can an optimal balance be found for those priorities? And then the third A is action. So we certainly don't want to do a lot of analysis, a lot of planning, and then just have a really nice plan that looks great and sits on the shelf, right? And so a key aspect to our planning processes is to really drive towards action plans, recommendations. We're showing here a GIS tool for solar potential in the British Virgin Islands. And so really digging into, okay, if the recommendation is to pursue solar PV, how do you start doing that? What are the specific things that need to happen now and by whom? And that really ties into the second piece of our work, which is focused on specific projects, and where we can line up this planning process with a specific project. That's where we see the best movement for sure. And so RMI's role, again, as a nonprofit, is typically on the preparation side for specific projects and de-risking. So taking care of things like moving through the permitting process. This example that I'm showing here in St. Lucia was the first large solar project in the country. And so when the planning department and the government or the permitting department got the proposal, they've never seen a proposal for a large solar PV project before. So there's an opportunity for us, again, as a neutral third party to help move that process forward, make sure that happened. You can see from the project picture on the bottom that this is right next to the airport. And so there was some additional assessment needed to ensure that that was going to be safe and, you know, good to put there right next to the runway. So we were able to support some of that. And then just some of the site assessment itself, studying the soil type, for example, with the geotechnical analysis. That means that when the project went out for procurement, all of those details could be included in the project description, and developers who were bidding to build the project then had that information and could come back with a really clear proposal, you know, confirmed costs. They didn't have to build in a lot of uncertainty or just build in extra for risk of the project, because a lot of the de-risking had been done ahead of time. So this is just one example. We've done project preparation with many of our partner islands, but you can see some of the benefits of this project in St. Lucia directly. This one is owned by the local utility company. So they own it. The procurement was for a company to come and build it for them. And so you can see how much it generates there, equivalent to about 3,500 homes in St. Lucia. So even though it's a 3 megawatt project, that's fairly significant on a grid that has a peak load of about 60 megawatts. So not bad for their first large scale solar project, and of course displaces some of the diesel fuel that they are still using for much of their generation, but now they don't use 100% diesel. So they're on that pathway moving forward. So I talked a bit about the sort of the planning, the analysis aspect, the supporting specific projects. And then the third piece of our work is really around building and supporting communities of practice. fostering knowledge exchange among regional leaders, regional experts, and those who are becoming or going to be the next round of experts and leaders. Providing connections, so as one island does their first battery energy storage project, for example, they can share what they're learning, what worked, what didn't work, with other islands directly. And so a couple communities that we have developed and supported are a broad renewable energy community in the Caribbean called CAREC, and then one focused on women in renewable energy as well, and connecting women, providing mentoring opportunities, again, from island women to island women, so that they're supporting each other and growing as leaders in the clean energy space in the region. So that's sort of the broad overview of how RMI works with islands. I wanted to share a specific example and share just some of the takeaways from doing this work. And so I picked the British Virgin Islands to talk about a bit. You can see on the map here where we're talking about. A bit more context on the British Virgin Islands, population of about 30,000 people. Their peak load is around 34 megawatts. Just for scale, the US a couple years ago was 470,000 megawatts. So again, these are small islands that we're working with. And they use diesel for generation. You can see the little lightning bolt on the map. The British Virgin Islands is really the definition of a centralized electricity system. So that lightning bolt is their one generating plant using diesel fuel that's imported. It serves that main island that you see there, Tortola, but also 10 of the other smaller islands that you see on the map are all connected through an undersea cable back to Tortola. So very centralized, one plant there that serves everything else pretty much across the set of islands. You may be aware that the British Virgin Islands was one place in the Caribbean that was heavily impacted by the 2017 hurricane season. So Hurricane Irma hit them very directly. Hurricane Maria, not long after, was less direct, but came right through the British Virgin Islands as well on the way to Puerto Rico, as you may know. And so significant damage, especially to the transmission and distribution system on Tortola. So that plant at that lightning bolt was actually okay. It came through the storm just fine, was able to get back up and operating fairly soon. But the overhead lines that connect it throughout the island and then to those undersea points to the other islands suffered a lot of damage. Just as an example of the impact that this storm had, I heard residents often referring to it as Miss Irma and talking about sort of the time before Miss Irma came and then what Miss Irma did on the island. And so it was, almost a sign of respect or a way of talking about just how significant this storm was. And so we had the opportunity to work in the BVI after the hurricanes. So I was first there just a couple months after they came through. And the energy leaders in the BVI really recognized this opportunity to think about how they rebuild, not just rebuild what they had, but redesign and think about resilience among their other energy priorities. So this is a photo that I took on one of those first trips where you can just see damaged electricity infrastructure. Looked like that pretty much across the island. So a couple of things I wanted to highlight from our experience working in the BVI is really the opportunity for a whole systems approach that can lead us to achieving multiple objectives. This is the same table that I had shown before, but again, just zooming in here on the British Virgin Islands, there were some really great conversations around what are really the priorities. Maybe not a surprise that resilience was so front of mind right after the hurricane, but it was there. But still some great discussion of, we're the leaders of the utility and the government, so this is what we think. If we asked any resident, though, low cost is extremely important to them as well. They want to see lower cost electricity, and so that's got to be in the list. Absolutely, we want to be stewards of the environment, and we want to think about the local economic development. So certainly anything that takes away jobs in the electricity sector is not something we want to pursue. But we also want to see, are there opportunities to actually create jobs and maybe spur new industries on the island as well. And so something that I took away here as well is sort of, although it wasn't stated right out, the theme of equity really cutting across all of these. And so when we think about resilience, being able to restore electricity service to everybody, and especially the more vulnerable populations quickly, is what we were really talking about in the BVI. Same with reliability and low cost. We want everyone to have access to reliable service. Again, this is separate from a hurricane situation when we say reliability. So during normal operation, we want the system to work well for everybody and provide electricity. We want costs to come down for everybody as well. Be stewards of our environment, and then, as I was mentioning, not just avoid any loss of jobs, but can we create more jobs and create opportunities in the clean energy sector in our island. And so that theme of how we could incorporate equity really came through as in this post-hurricane situation. The stakeholders were thinking through what was going to be most important for them. So I've talked a bit about the planning process and the analysis that we do. A lot of that is running models and stuff I really enjoy as an electrical engineer. It's also really important to understand the practical realities, right? That's got to inform the design of an optimal approach. So some of those to highlight in the BVI is just really limited flat space. And this is pretty common across small islands as well. They're kind of small. Some are flat and have lots of space, but the BVI, especially the main island in Tortola, is quite hilly. And so here's a photo of some of the limited flat space, and you can see right behind it are these large hills. And so, looking at opportunities to utilize that flat space, balancing with the fact, okay, we've been talking a lot this morning about this afternoon on priorities for the electricity sector. We often need to zoom out a little bit to priorities for the whole country. And so, for example, the opportunity or desire to diversify their economy away from a core focus on tourism and think about things like agriculture. Meanwhile, the current agriculture sector is heavily dependent on imports as well. And so a desire to utilize more local resources, see what they could do locally in terms of food. Well, the flat space is prime for that as well. And so, really understanding, okay, zooming out from electricity a bit, what are the broader priorities? Because on the one hand, this looks like a perfect spot for solar PV, but there's others thinking this is a perfect spot for me to do some farming. And so looking for opportunities to bring those priorities together and find solutions that benefit both or all. So I put an example here from another small island, St. Eustatius, where they raise the solar up a little bit and then are able to grow shade crops underneath. There's some other great examples in the Caribbean, more around grazing type agriculture and having sheep that graze among the panels, which provides multiple benefits. You never have to mow that grass then. The sheep have a place to live and to eat. So, there are opportunities to think about how to bring these together. But being there, really understanding what's the reality on the ground has been key to starting to unlock some of these broader opportunities. The other thing I'll highlight for the BVI is that this flat area is near the community college. So there's another link there in terms of thinking about, okay, how could clean energy tie into their curriculum. If some of the space on and near the community college is used for solar, for example, can that work with the community college to build into their curriculum for their courses, even training on solar installation, those types of things. So an update, I guess, of today following the planning process that we did, that this is sort of the key site that's being considered. There's a project moving forward that's focused on resilience, so solar and battery energy storage at this site, still looking at how to best incorporate with agriculture, use the space for these multiple priorities. But resilience really comes in here. I mentioned the community college is right on the site, and so being able to continue supplying that if there were an outage on the main grid is important. The other facility that's right here is both the water treatment and the wastewater treatment plants. And so those are part of the design of this project that's moving forward now as well. How can those be considered as part of the critical loads that would be served by solar and storage on site if the rest of the system were down. Meanwhile, when the system's operating normally, this project on this site would contribute to that overall electricity system, providing lower cost electricity, feeding in and supporting the technical operation of the grid. So it's a really exciting opportunity. But what I really wanted to highlight here is it's not always as simple as running the numbers, running the models. There's practical realities that have to fold into that. And as part of that, I think I just want to highlight the importance of spending time on the ground, especially with people. Seeing the sites and seeing everything firsthand is crucial as well. Spending time with people not only helps our understanding of the context and what's important and what's possible, but also just builds connectivity and trust with everyone. So I wanted to highlight here a couple more photos from after the hurricane. But on the left, you can see us, we've got everyone gathered here, and you can see at the end of the room there's nothing on the screen. There was no projector, right? This is post-Hurricane Irma. There's no projector. The lights weren't really working in the room. You can kind of see the ceilings kind of all damaged there. But everybody recognized that this is crucial, coming together to really think about how they can redesign their electricity system to provide these multiple benefits. Resilience for sure front of mind after the hurricanes, but not just that, right? Lowering costs is still top of mind. Providing reliable electricity all the time, not just coming back from a hurricane. And so it really showed the commitment of these stakeholders. Again, this is a mix of government and utility representatives that we brought together here, along with a few of us from RMI, who are coming together and saying, yeah, let's think about what's most important and identify an optimal pathway to get there. So I did want to share some of that results so you can see where that came from or where this ended up, which is identifying an optimal energy mix that really focuses on solar and storage in a more distributed way. So I've mentioned a lot about the centralized nature of most island electricity systems today, including in the BVI. So looking at opportunities to be more distributed in the location of resources and not depending on one plant in one spot and overhead lines to connect to everywhere else. So distributed solar and storage, maybe not surprisingly again, given the local resource, the cost of these options, came out to be part of the optimal mix. And again, we found the opportunity for multiple benefits here, from reducing costs fairly significantly to operate the system, saving fuel, leading to local investment in projects and in people to implement these projects, maintaining system reliability and improving resilience as well overall. So that's a specific example from the BVI. And so I just want to sort of close by coming back to the overall role of islands as I see it within global energy transitions. I really see islands flipping their role. So we talked at the beginning about their vulnerability to to external shocks, to climate change directly. And so in some sense, they could be seen as some of the first victims of climate change. But they're, instead of, taking on that role, they're really flipping to be energy transition leaders and saying, what can we do to transition our systems, benefit our countries directly, and the people who live here, and provide examples then to the world of what's possible. And those may apply in different ways. There's other isolated small systems like islands in different places around the world, but even larger systems as well can take experiences from islands and use it to inform their approaches to clean energy transition. So I'll stop there. That's, an overview of our work and some of the things we've learned about partnering with islands. I'm really happy to hear some of the questions that everybody has and try to answer those. I also have my email and my contact information here. So if anyone did want to follow up afterwards, I'm happy to do that as well.
Thanks a lot, Kaitlyn. Really appreciate it. Great talk. We definitely have time, probably 15 minutes or so, maybe 20 for questions, answers. Some of them already come up in the Q&A dialog box, which you have on your screen there. And so you can take a look at them, or if you want me to field them, I can provide them to you directly, whatever works for you.
Sure, either way. I'm gonna stop sharing just so we show up a little bigger here. Yeah, why don't you pick one to start, Stephen, and then I'll check out.
Okay, yeah, there's some great questions here. So I think one question that was brought up was, how do you deal with land use and limited land in island nations, and thinking about utility scale solar? And coupled with that also, did you really only look at solar and storage, or did you look at a wide variety of technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. To the second part, we look at a wide variety. Typically solar is a good option for most of these islands, given their location and the resource there. So that's typically always on the list. But some islands have a great wind resource. So we'll explore that as well. Some are volcanic islands. So we'll look at the potential for geothermal. It's sort of, again, whatever the possibilities might be for that island, we'll look at that. It's just that solar and storage are typically on the list because they're such good resources. And the land question is a good one as well. On the one hand, we ourselves, and I think a lot of our island partners, have been somewhat surprised when we have done sort of spatial assessments of land possibility and essentially found more land than we thought, right? It's a decent hypothesis to start with of these are small islands. There's just not that much land available, and especially flat land. But we have found by doing, island-wide assessments that there's often more space than we might initially think. At the same time, as I was mentioning, there's competing uses for that land, whether that's agriculture or tourism. So it's also not as simple as let's just find all the flat land and cover it. So what we found is a balance of actually being able to do some pretty sizable utility scale projects in a lot of places. And at the same time, looking at the opportunity for solar to be more incorporated in the built environment. And so that can mean on rooftops, it can mean solar parking canopies as well. Costs a little more to do upfront, but we've been able to do it still to really good hurricane standards to be able to withstand strong hurricanes. And then it provides, protection from the sun and rain for cars that are parked. So multiple benefits there. So we've sort of taken that balanced approach of, yeah, you can find some space usually for a large utility project. And then let's look at other, maybe smaller individual installations, but we can aggregate those together often to get to still a really good scale of a project that's really attractive and gets a good price for a developer to come and build.
Great, thanks. Another question that's been asked here, and one I know you guys think about a lot, is there's been a lot of talk, and some people have acted on it, by commercial businesses, hotels, for example, to say, well, this is very expensive electricity. I'm going to just take myself off the grid, which of course means there's fewer people on the grid, which raises costs. So how do you guys think about that? How do you balance that? How do you incent, getting things that work for everybody equitably, as opposed to just whoever can afford to put in their own energy system.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we think about a lot. And certainly a place we can improve as well. I think we tend to, start working with the utility and think about country scale and with the utility, but we can and should do more with individual stakeholders as well to understand where they're coming from and their opportunities. What we found through our analysis is that in the small island context, the role of the utility can be quite crucial. And so it might look different from a larger country like the US, where perhaps having more competitors might make more sense. In the small island context, where there's one utility for this size of the system, that's often does lead to lowest cost for everyone. And so that means for us thinking about, okay, the utility plays this central role, but likely their business model, their approaches need to change overall. And that could look like partnering with commercial customers, hotels, for example, to utilize the space that they have available, but rather than having them go off grid, and as Stephen said, now they're on their own, leaving the rest of the country to pay for the expensive electricity system. Can we keep it as one system that benefits both parties? So those clean energy resources are still connected to the grid, benefiting the system over time, and lowering costs for everyone. And so there's different ways to think about that in terms of who owns the resources, who owns the property that they're on, and can the utility work with commercial customers. The other one we've been really focused on lately is with government partners. And so looking at critical facilities, particularly when it comes to resilience, could the utility own and operate distributed energy resources on a government site like a hospital or a wastewater treatment plant that can contribute to the grid all the time and provide various benefits, and then separate and serve that critical load if there were an issue on the main grid. And so that again leads to changing the approach of the utility in terms of only owning big stuff and only owning stuff on their own property, right? But looking at leasing or just different ownership models is something we're exploring quite a lot.
And Kaitlyn, I think it's fair to say that in general, if you do something like you did in BVI or in St. Lucia, the value of the system that goes in and the benefits it provides in terms of lowering rates and such is usually higher than any individual building could do on their own and put in their own storage system. So I think the economics are generally favorable as long as the utility is being proactive about pursuing new sources of supply.
Yes.
There's another great question that came up, which has to do with, you've talked a bunch about energy, the technology, the techno-economic part of this equation, stakeholders such as the government and utilities, but could you expand a little bit more about other public interest groups, citizens groups, whatever they might be, other stakeholder groups basically, and then how that might fit into thinking about issues around energy justice and energy equitableness.
Yeah, absolutely. Another key group or set of stakeholders that we've often come across and work with is solar developers themselves. So that's always great that there's a local solar industry often building in islands, and they're eager to move forward, of course, and implement projects. And so getting their perspectives has been really great, especially when it comes to sort of the policy and regulation or lack of it in different islands, and what could really unlock more of a local solar market. So that's been great. And then just interacting with communities as well and the public. We often will hold public consultations as part of these energy planning processes and say, here's the process, here's what we're looking at, different options being explored for these priorities. And that's where we often get a lot of really good feedback as well. What's been interesting is often even after presenting some of the hard numbers of here's the costs of these resources, once they're incorporated into the overall system, here's what it would mean for total cost. Usually the first question is still about, okay, but is my bill going to go up? And so, you know, that's been eye-opening too, to really see, okay, what is the most crucial for the people that are using electricity and paying for it every day, and getting more of their perspectives. I think the one other piece I'd offer is most of the islands that we work in are fully electrified. So everybody's on the grid, everybody has electricity today. The outlier to that within our portfolio is in Belize, which I shared some of the priorities for earlier. And you may have noted, Belize is not an island. That's true. It's connected to Central America, but culturally, they're quite Caribbean, and they're part of the Caribbean community. So we've had the opportunity to work there as well. And they are highly electrified, but about 92%. So there's communities that don't have electricity at all today. So we've had the opportunity to interact with some of those communities and really understand what's most important to them in terms of getting electricity. What do they want it for? And that can really inform then the design of an optimal system, whether that's some kind of standalone microgrid system or a plan to extend the grid to reach these communities. So that's been, really interesting to get input as well from those specific communities to what they're looking for.
Great, thanks. Another question came up. Say if you could speak a little bit about the financing. I mean, how do these things get paid for? Obviously, it's a critical question.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can vary from project to project. So some, like the St. Lucia project that I mentioned, was funded by the utility company. So they used their funds that they had and paid for it, and they own it. And so that's one model. In other cases, as part of sort of putting the project together and some of the preparation, some of our role is to identify financing opportunities. And that can come through some of the more local or regional institutions like the Caribbean Development Bank providing specific financing. Sometimes it's more of the global institutions like Inter-American Development Bank. Sometimes it's a mix as well of loan possibilities and financing for different projects. So, we kind of look for opportunities and put together what's going to be best for each project. We sort of do see the opportunity for some either loan or, grant resources in often the very first projects on islands to really get that first project unlocked, get it in the ground operating, and start to open up the market. We certainly don't see that long-term, all these clean energy projects would be funded by grants. The business case is strong, and so once we can sort of open up the clean energy market in specific islands and in the region in general, then it's more about lining things up with different financing opportunities for specific projects rather than the philanthropic funding.
Great. And then another question that came up, which I think relates back to the process you developed, which is, did you use any multi-criteria decision-making method for the comparative analysis and evaluation? And if so, which one? Which I think the question implies some proprietary, some commercially available one, but maybe you want to expand a little bit about the decision criteria you used and the methodology that you used.
Yeah, absolutely. So often what we'll do is sort of build the scenarios that we're going to look at. So a couple of different pathways that an island could take, from keep using diesel is usually a business as usual, to pursue different mixes of renewable resources, maybe in different configurations too. We can look at, sometimes we've looked at, should they stay fairly centralized in large projects versus more distributed? Who should own these projects? Some of that can be built into the scenarios as well, not just what resources. But then we often use a couple of different tools to investigate the performance, I'll say, of these scenarios. So on the technical side, will the grid actually work with this mix of resources? And if not, we need to modify the resources or include the costs of making upgrades to the grid, for example, to include those resources. So build that in. On the economic side, what do the actual costs look like? What would each of these scenarios mean for costs of the system? And then how we sort of evaluate and look at these multiple criteria at the same time is to take all those results, take the priorities that were set, and you saw next to them numbers. So we actually ask the stakeholders to say, okay, out of 100 points, you've now put these in order. Let's say it's low cost, reliability, sustainability. Now, how many points would you give each out of 100? So we can really rank them against each other. Then within each of those, we'll have specific metrics. So for cost, we might look at total cost to operate the system. We might have a metric in there around cost volatility, and using some forecasting, analyze what's the likely monthly or yearly fluctuation in cost, not just the cost itself. And so we use the results of our scenario modeling to then calculate each of these specific metrics and get to a score for each scenario and add those up. And then we can really see how they stack up against each other. And it's not always a simple answer of, well, this one got the least or the most points, so that's the answer. That's what you should do. But it gives the island stakeholders the full picture. And so, yes, you get the one with the most points overall, but can also start to see, okay, these scenarios scored really high on resilience. These scored really high on low cost. And of course, identify the ones that do the best across the board, but just inform the thinking and the options that do best in the different areas, if that makes sense.
That's great, thanks. And then we have one last question, then we should wrap up.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit more about resiliency? Maybe BVI is a good example. You're going to get blasted by hurricanes, and maybe more regularly and bigger ones. How does sustainable energy fit into that equation, especially since you said the actual central plants themselves are usually in pretty hardened buildings, don't suffer damage. So is this increasing or decreasing? I guess resiliency is the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think about it sometimes on multiple layers. So more of the system resilience layer, what we're seeing is that sustainable energy can improve the resilience of the system overall in a couple of ways, especially when it's implemented in a more distributed manner. So using different locations and different types of resources removes the potential for sort of single failures, bringing everything down. And so, as you mentioned, yep, the plant itself survived, and that often is the case in islands. But there's other sort of single failure points potential with that. One is fuel itself. If you couldn't get fuel to the island for any reason, then you're sort of out of luck. And then that wasn't the case in the BVI, but what they did see is the failure of the overhead transmission system, then causing that plant to be there ready to operate and not able to. And so by distributing resources in different locations and really focusing on the most critical facilities, hospitals, water treatment, having those operate connected most of the time can be really beneficial, but then able to sort of keep those small pockets running or get them back up much more quickly than having to rebuild the transmission from the plant all the way down to everything in order to restore electricity. So that's sort of the underlying approach with, clean options, distributed options, supporting the resilience of the system overall. But then there's another layer of the equipment itself. And so just like the diesel plant surviving, can a solar plant survive the hurricane? If not, then it's not helping system resilience either. And so that's another component that we think about. And we did some analysis after Hurricanes Irma and Maria of some solar plants that survived and they were operating the next day, and some that did not and saw a lot of damage for different reasons. And so that's something we folded into our work as well, as sort of what are the best practices or even standards, we can think of them as, for first the design and then the implementation of systems that are actually designed to handle a Category 5 hurricane. And that may lead to another question of, okay, that sounds great. You want them to be really hardened and be able to survive the storm, but that probably costs more. It does, but we found that that can be about a 5% increase in cost upfront to design and build to that standard. And even now, solar costs, the modules themselves continue to drop. And so within a year or two, you've essentially made up that balance of the extra costs to build to a resilient standard from continuing declining costs of the infrastructure itself. And so that's more of the sort of like equipment level layer of resilience that we're thinking about as well, to ensure that specific projects actually do support a more resilient system overall.
Great, thanks. Well, I think that's all the questions for now. Kaitlyn, I want to thank you again so much for being willing to get on the Zoom channel with us today and be part of this webinar. It's really been great and given us a chance to see what is really, as you say, a microcosm of where the world is going in terms of adopting high levels of sustainable energy that are resilient, cost-effective, and reliable. So again, thank you so much from us at the Irving Institute and everybody else who participated today. And I think Stephanie's going to push a slide onto the screen here about our upcoming events. But again, Kaitlyn, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to all our participants. We really appreciate you joining in. Thanks for your great questions. And if you have any further ones, please feel free to contact Kaitlyn directly on the email she provided on her final slide. And if any of you didn't capture that, I'm sure we can push you on to her from our own website if necessary. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.